The disaster didn't happen all at once. It began quietly with the first heavy rains of the 2024 rainy season in West and Central Africa. By March, rivers in Ghana and other countries in the region were already swelling, sending early warnings of flooding into communities downstream. Forecasters had predicted above average rainfall, but no one could foresee the unprecedented scale of what was to come. By June, early floods had displaced thousands, damaging homes and crops and claiming the first lives of the season. These initial signs were a harbinger of the catastrophe ahead, showing just how vulnerable the region had become to extreme weather. Then, in July and August, the rains intensified into relentless torrents. Countries like Chad, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo were hammered away as rivers overflowed, submerging towns and isolating communities. In Chad, the floods affected nearly 2 million people by late October, prompting the government to declare a state of national disaster. Across Nigeria, rivers broke their banks, turning entire towns into temporary lakes, forcing residents to flee their homes with little more than what they could carry. On September 10th, after continuous heavy rainfall, the dikes at the Alau Reservoir in northern Nigeria collapsed. This single failure sent a wall of water into Maiduguri, a city of over 1 million residents, displacing more than 200,000 people in a single day. The rains did not stop in September as expected. Instead, they persisted through October and into November, ensuring that floodwaters kept rising and communities remained submerged. By the end of October, more than 7 million people across 18 countries had been impacted, with the scale of destruction surpassing the previous year by 40%. The 2024 flood season had become the worst in decades for much of the region, a slow-motion disaster that refused to end. This creeping, relentless deluge marked the first stage of a crisis that would leave millions homeless, wipe out livelihoods, and test the resilience of governments and humanitarian organizations across the continent. The timeline of the floods shows not a single moment of disaster, but a series of escalating calamities, each compounding the next, and each revealing the fragile relationship between people, rivers, and the climate they depend upon. The scale of the 2024 floods was not simply a natural accident. It was the result of a dangerous combination of climate change and human vulnerability. Scientists from the World Weather Attribution Network determined that human-caused global warming made the season's extreme rainfall between 5 and 20% more intense across the Lake Chad basins. The warming atmosphere holds more moisture, releasing it in torrential downpours that overwhelmed rivers and drainage systems. Temperatures in the central Sahel region have been rising 50% faster than the global average, turning events that were once rare into recurring disasters. Human factors worsened the impact. Rapid and unplanned urban growth pushed millions of people into flood-prone areas, while aging infrastructure, from city drainage networks to dams, proved incapable of handling the volume of water. The Alau Reservoir dike collapse in northern Nigeria was tragic but predictable, a failure magnified by years of insufficient maintenance. In cities like Niamey and Lagos, poorly designed drainage and blocked waterways funneled floodwaters into residential neighborhoods, leaving thousands stranded and homes destroyed. Deforestation and land degradation also played a significant role. With fewer trees and vegetation to absorb rainfall, soil quickly turned into runoff, accelerating flooding in both urban and rural areas. Rivers that historically could contain seasonal rains became uncontrollable channels of destruction, sweeping away bridges, roads, and farmland. In essence, the floods were a perfect storm, natural rainfall amplified by climate change, funneled into regions unprepared for extreme weather. The combination of environmental degradation, rapid urbanization, and insufficient infrastructure created a disaster that was far larger than any single factor could have caused. The science behind the catastrophe shows that this was not just a seasonal event, but a stark warning of the increasing vulnerability of West and Central Africa to climate extremes. Beyond maps and data, the 2024 floods left a staggering human cost that will be remembered for decades. Across the affected region, the floods ultimately impacted 7.5 million people, uprooting lives and shattering communities. At least 1,527 people lost their lives, either drowned in fast-moving waters or trapped under collapsing homes, while an additional 4,499 suffered injuries. Entire families were forced to abandon their homes, with 1.7 million people becoming internal climate refugees, navigating flooded roads and unsafe shelters. The scale of displacement overwhelmed both formal and informal support systems. In Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, entire neighborhoods were submerged, forcing residents to seek refuge in schools, mosques, and makeshift camps. The destruction of over 649,000 homes left countless people exposed to the elements, often with no access to clean water or electricity. Children were particularly vulnerable. In Sudan, they accounted for 15% of cholera cases and deaths as contaminated floodwaters spread disease. Beyond immediate survival, the floods disrupted education and healthcare. Schools and hospitals were damaged or destroyed, cutting off access to vital services just when communities needed them most. Contaminated water sources led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, with cholera and diarrhea claiming additional lives. For families, the disaster was a double blow. First, the loss of shelter and possessions, and then the prolonged fight for health and stability. The human toll was compounded by the psychological strain. Survivors faced the trauma of losing loved ones, livelihoods, and entire neighborhoods. Children watched their schools and playgrounds washed away while adults struggled to provide basic necessities amidst chaos. These social and emotional scars, while less quantifiable than death counts or property damage, are just as enduring and define the long-term impact of the 2024 floods on West and Central Africa. The 2024 floods did not just wash away homes, they devastated entire economies and agricultural systems across West and Central Africa. An estimated 960,000 hectares of farmland were rendered unusable, an area larger than the country of Cyprus, just as crops were approaching harvest. This destruction threatened food security for millions, wiping out months of labor and leaving entire communities facing severe shortages. In Nigeria alone, over 315,000 acres of farmland were lost by mid-September, while in Chad, nearly 900,000 acres of fields were submerged under floodwaters. Livestock losses further compounded the economic impact. An estimated 128,000 cattle were swept away, removing a vital source of income, nutrition, and trade for countless families. These losses were not only immediate, but also long-term, as herds take years to rebuild. Infrastructure destruction magnified the crisis. Roads, bridges, and irrigation systems were obliterated, isolating rural communities and slowing the delivery of aid and recovery efforts. Over 1,277 schools and 221 health facilities were damaged or destroyed, depriving children of education and communities of medical care during the height of the crisis. Markets, storage facilities, and transportation networks were also disrupted, creating cascading effects on regional trade and economies. The financial toll of the 2024 floods is still being assessed, but preliminary estimates suggest losses in the billions of dollars, contributing to the already staggering $10 billion in annual climate-related losses across Africa. Beyond the immediate economic shock, the destruction undermined years of development progress, leaving communities even more vulnerable to future disasters. The floods were a stark reminder that the consequences of extreme weather extend far beyond water. They ripple through every facet of life, from food and income to education and health. The most alarming aspect of the 2024 West and Central Africa floods is that they are not likely to be isolated events. Scientists warn that as global temperatures continue to rise, extreme rainfall and flooding will become more frequent and more severe across the Sahel and Central Africa regions. These recurrent climate shocks leave communities with little time to recover, amplifying both economic losses and humanitarian vulnerability. Africa's disproportionate exposure to climate impacts is a stark injustice. The continent emits a fraction of global greenhouse gases, yet its populations suffer some of the most severe consequences. Countries already grappling with poverty, food insecurity, and conflict faced an even harsher reality as the floods magnified existing social and economic fragilities. Displacement, destruction, and disease created a cycle that left millions even more vulnerable to the next disaster. International aid, while critical, remains insufficient to fully address the scale of the crisis. Agencies such as the UN, IFRC, and UNICEF have mobilized relief operations, but logistical challenges and limited funding mean that recovery is slow and incomplete. Communities must not only rebuild homes, but also restore infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and agricultural systems to mitigate future risks. Experts emphasize that long-term adaptation is essential. Investment in resilient infrastructure, improved flood management systems, early warning networks, and sustainable development is critical to prevent similar devastation. The floods of 2024 exposed gaps in planning, governance, and disaster preparedness that must be addressed. Ultimately, the disaster serves as a warning to the global community. The 2024 floods were not just a natural catastrophe, they were a man-made disaster amplified by climate change and societal vulnerability. For the 7.5 million people affected, the memories of submerged homes, ruined livelihoods, and lost loved ones will linger for decades. The waters may have receded, but the lessons remain. Without urgent action on climate resilience and global cooperation, the next flood could be even more devastating.